Hello, this video is a tutorial for how to create an animated water cycle using Scratch. This is part of a lesson that's geared towards upper elementary school students in 4th or 5th grade, and it aims to integrate biology knowledge with important programming concepts. By completing this project, students should be reinforcing their knowledge of natural processes, in this case the water cycle, as well as learning important technology learning goals. Now, the emphasis for this lesson will be on the actual coding portion. And so because of that, elements such as the background over here and the important sprites, in this case evaporation, cloud, rain, and river, will be provided and can be personalized at the end. Before we begin the tutorial, let's do a quick review of the lesson plan. You can find a copy of this lesson plan to the left of this video. At the beginning, the first 10 minutes are dedicated to reviewing what the water cycle is and the mechanisms that create this natural process. After the first 10 minutes, the students will begin to gather in groups and do a brainstorm and illustration of the different mechanisms and create an outline for how they would create an animation of these natural processes. After that, the teacher will begin by demonstrating how to implement some of the foundational aspects of this project in Scratch. Students will follow along on their own versions of this project and will establish the initial sequencing and a few of the animations with loops, just to get an understanding of the core principles behind this lesson. And then for the remainder of the time, students will be allowed to practice and develop their skills with both sequences and loops. And will also have the opportunity to complete additional challenges and to personalize their projects and really make it their own. At the end of the lesson, there will be a classroom discussion on what students learned both about the water cycle and about coding, and a brief assessment to test knowledge on both the water cycle and sequencing and loops. Hopping back into Scratch, let's see what sequencing and loops look like in our code. I should say that this is not supposed to be an introductory lesson to Scratch, and so I'm not going to be going over every single block that I'm placing in this project. But if you do need a little bit of a refresher on some of the more basic elements of Scratch, I will be linking a tutorial below. Now, looking at this project so far, you can see that there's only a few simple blocks in each of our different sprites here. They all have the same thing. It's a when green flag is clicked block and a show block. Right now, all of our sprites are hidden, and all that this code will do is that when I click this green flag, all of our sprites appear. But obviously, this isn't exactly what we want. We want to create an animated cycle that shows all of the processes going in sequence, and so that's where our sequencing is going to come in. To create sequencing, the first block I'm going to use is the broadcast block, and you can find that in the yellow events section here. So I'll pull out this button right here, which is broadcast message 1. I'm actually going to change this, so I'm going to click into new message, and I'm going to make a message called 1. If you want to use message 1, that's fine, but for me, I just find that using numbers makes things easier down the line. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to pull this apart, and instead of just having the green flag show the evaporation lines here, I'm going to have the green flag broadcast a message 1. And what this does is it basically will communicate between different sprites and different parts of your code that an event needs to happen. In this case, any event triggered by 1. And the way we can have that event happen is by pulling over here and grabbing the when I receive message block. So I'll pull that one out, and I need to go and click the corresponding number here. So I have when I receive 1 show. And so you can see that when I click this button, it makes the evaporation line show. And right now it doesn't look like a lot has changed, but it'll make more sense and it'll be more obvious once we add this to all of our blocks. So I'll go ahead and hide everything again. And this time I'm going to add a wait block. This may not be in the final project, but I'm going to use it to show what happens in our sequence. So I'm going to put a wait 1 second block. And then I'm going to grab one more of our broadcast blocks. And this time I'm going to change it to say broadcast 2. And so what I've done here is I've created an initial broadcast that creates an action. In this case, it'll show the evaporation lines. And after the evaporation lines show, it'll wait 1 second and then broadcast 2. And what I can do is, instead of having the green flag click, when I receive 2 in the cloud sprites code, it will now have the cloud show up after the evaporation lines. But now when I click the green flag, you can see the evaporation lines show up, and then the cloud shows up. So I'll be back in a second after adding this code to the other blocks, and I'll show you how this looks when it's all finished. Okay, so I created blocks in every single one of these sprites here that create a sequence. You can see it goes from broadcast 2 to receiving 2 to broadcast 3 to receiving 3 to broadcast 4 to receiving 4. And when we click the green flag, we can see evaporation shows up, then cloud, then rain, then river. So this is the essence of sequencing. It's creating events that happen in a particular order. In this case, when we're illustrating the water cycle, we want to show that water gets evaporated, then it condenses, then it forms precipitation, and then it runs back into the ocean or another body of water to be evaporated again. Next, we'll take a look at how to create animations to make this look a little bit nicer. The way we'll create animations is by using loops. So you can find your loops over in the orange control section. One of the loops that I'm going to use is the repeat 10 block here. The 10 tells you how many times the function within this bracket will repeat. So I'm going to place this in right after the show block, and I'm going to set the number of times repeat to 5 because I don't want it to be 10 times. That's a little bit too long. And there's a few ways that you can animate something to make it really pop on the screen. Those animations are going to be in the purple looks section. And for the evaporation lines, what I'm going to do is change the size so that it creates a pulsing effect. One way you can do this is by doing the following. You'll use the change size by block, which will change the size by about 10 pixels here. To make it loop, I'm going to put in a wait block and have it wait about half a second. And then I'll put another change in size by block. But in this case, I'm going to say minus 10 so that it goes back and forth instead of just getting bigger and bigger and bigger or smaller and smaller and smaller. Then I'll put in one more wait block, and then I'll put my broadcast block at the bottom. So what happens in this chunk here is that after this message 1 is received, the evaporation lines will appear and then will pulse 5 times before then broadcasting 2 and having the cloud appear. And you can see what that looks like right now. Already it's a lot more interesting to look at. The other kind of animation that I'll show you is changing costume, and I'll use the rain as an example of that. So just like what we did with the other one, we'll keep the show block and we'll use a repeat 10 block. I'm again going to make it repeat 5, and inside here, instead of using the change size, I'm actually going to use the change costume here. And before I do that, let me quickly show you what I mean. In the sprite menu, there is a costume tab right next to the code tab. And with pre-made sprites or with sprites that you make yourself, you have the option to have multiple costumes. In this case, I have 2. They look a little bit different from each other. And you can see as I click between them, if I alternate between them, it looks kind of like rain is falling. And that's what I'm going to do in my code. So I will click the next costume tab here. Right now the rain is in costume 1. When the next costume block gets activated, it switches to costume 2. Then I will put my wait block. Again, I'll do half a second. And then I'll do next costume, which will, if it's at the last costume, it'll switch it back to costume 1. And I'll put a wait block again. And at the end, I will put my broadcast so that it continues on in the sequence. And now what should happen is that when the rain appears, it will switch between costume 1 and costume 2 and make it look like rain is falling. So let's take a look. So we have our evaporation, and then our cloud appears, and then the rain falls. And so those are the 2 different kinds of animation that you can use, and I'll show you a final version of this project right now, just so you can get an idea of what it can look like. Okay, so let's take a look at this example project that's completed. And you'll notice that it goes a little bit beyond what we covered in the tutorial, where it adds a little bit of movement for the cloud and also creates an endless loop, which is one of the challenges that you can give your students and which I'll show you how to do really briefly at the end. But let's take a look at what it looks like. And you can see it starts over. So if we look inside the code really quick, you can see that everything looks pretty much the same. We have broadcast 1, broadcast 2, and then there's a little bit of extra stuff to make it look nicer. Then when I receive 2, broadcast 3, it goes all the way through. But then when you get to the river, it goes through its entire animation, and then broadcasts 1 again. And this brings us back to the beginning and creates an endless loop. And so this is one of the challenges, like I said, that you can give your students to see if they really understand how you can create sequences and loops and use them in an illustration of a natural cycle like the water cycle. Well, I hope you enjoyed learning about this. I really enjoyed making it, and I'm sure your students will too.